We now move on to our second panel, which is on international perspectives on social media and political communication. And it is my great, great pleasure to introduce Danielle K. Brown from the University of Minnesota, who is not only going to chair this panel, but she has kindly accepted our invitation to become an associate editor of IJPP starting next year. Danielle is also guest editing together with Summer Harlow, a special issue of the journal on protest and the press. The deadline to submit manuscripts to that special issue is today. And so Danielle is going to play a very important role in the development of our journal in the next few years, and I'm very grateful for her leadership and for accepting our invitation to work with us. And without further ado, Danielle, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that gracious introduction. I appreciate it. Good morning from Minnesota. Good afternoon there. I am pleased to just get on the ball and start going with these presentations. So our first presentation is going to be called Exploring Digital Campaign Competence, the Role of Voter Knowledge on Data-Driven Election Campaigns. Just as a reminder for presenters, you have 25 minutes to present, both for your presentation and discussion. I will give you a 12 and 15-minute warning. And for those of you in the audience today, please remember to put your questions into the chat while they're talking, and we will try to get to them as quickly as possible. And without further ado, if the authors Sophie Minihold and et al. Would like to present, we'll get started.
Thank you. All right, if everything goes well, you should see my presentation now. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Sophie Minihold. I'm part of the Data-Driven Northwest project, and my first paper explores digital campaign competence, the role of knowledge in data-driven election campaigns. And I co-authored this paper with my supervisors, Sophie Lecheler, Claes Vreese, and Sanne Kruikemeier. Please note that this is work in progress and input is appreciated. Current election campaigns are different from previous election campaigns in various ways. Through the possibility of campaigning on social media, political parties are airing political advertisements all the time. Next to this, vast amounts of voter data are increasingly being used by political parties, and not only in the US. Research has shown that this also happens in Europe. This led to data-driven political advertising. In short, information about voters is gathered, such as demographics, age, gender, location, and their online behavior, such as page visits, likes. And then political ads are created, as well as campaigns evaluated. And supposedly interested voters are targeted with these ads. The goal, of course, is to mobilize voters and to engage them in the campaign. While election campaigns changed, most voters did not change. This means that voters lack knowledge about these changed election campaigns, and they underestimate the possibilities of datafication. Lack of knowledge is problematic because it makes people less aware of the implications that come with data-driven advertising. For example, it leads to an information asymmetry. Not everyone gets the same information. Data-driven campaigns should deliver content to voters in which they are supposedly most interested, and on the other hand, avoid spending resources on voters who are not interested in a specific content. Second, the more I know about how my data can be used by politicians, the more I might want to control my data online. So a lack of knowledge is also problematic for empowered internet use. Lastly, uneven distribution of knowledge leads to new digital divides. Voters find themselves in a new political playing field. They are required to find their way around election campaigns, who are the candidates, what are the issues, but they are also supposed to have the ability to understand the implications that voter data is being used in election campaigns and what effect it has on their lives. Fulfilling these requirements is important because voters should be empowered to make informed decisions. Based on political knowledge and persuasion knowledge literature, I focus on three concepts that play a role in explaining the role of knowledge in data-driven election campaigns: self-efficacy, privacy concerns, and political interest. Self-efficacy is associated with being able to understand what giving informed consent means, or understanding what it means when companies are being transparent about data collection. If someone knows about data-driven advertising techniques, one feels more confident and one feels confident enough to counter these techniques. So it's a reciprocal relationship, so to say. The more you feel confident, the more you know, and vice versa. And second, privacy concerns might play a role because for data-driven advertising, personal data is being collected. And this is relevant because people with high privacy concerns are more likely to develop negative attitudes towards data-driven advertising. That's what research has shown. Third and last, research found that political knowledge predicts knowledge about political advertising. Essential for political knowledge is interest in politics. And I was interested to see if political interest would also play a role in explaining knowledge about data-driven advertising. So the overarching question for the study is, what role does knowledge about data-driven political advertising play in data-driven political election campaigns? Because data-driven advertising can take us various forms and comes with various implications, knowledge about these practices consists of various components too. We suggest that these 4 components constitute knowledge about data-driven political advertising. So the 4 components that are on the slide. In this study, we try to capture knowledge through general and more specific questions, social media specific questions, because data-driven advertising happens on social media often, and we focus on privacy literacy and data collection knowledge because personal data is being collected. In this study, we ask 2 big questions. First, what predicts knowledge? Which voter characteristics make voters more likely to be knowledgeable? And second, how does knowledge affect campaign engagement? A large body of literature has investigated behavioral responses towards people's how people engage with advertising and advertisements. So either they avoid it or they approach it. These 4 expectations aim to answer research question 1. We expect that young, male, highly educated, privacy concerned, self-efficacious, and politically interested people know more about data-driven advertising. To investigate our expectations, we conducted a 2-wave panel survey. Data was collected by the I&O Research Institute in the Netherlands, and we collected the data during the Dutch general election of 2021. So that happened in February and March. The first wave, we had 1,264 respondents, and in wave 2, 1,071. We got a representative sample where 48% were female and on average 52 years old. Most people had medium education, but roughly 40% also had higher education. People in wave 1 and wave 2 did not significantly differ with regard to their demographics. Here you see our key variables from the study. Most interesting here to point out is the first, namely data-driven political advertising knowledge. So this scale we developed based on Smit, Van Voorveld, Van Noort, and Voorveld. It's 6 statements, and people can have maximum 6 statements correct. They tap into the 4 knowledge categories that are presented before, and these 6 statements differ with regard to their difficulty level. The mean shows that people on average got 1.8 questions correct, which is not a lot. Self-efficacy, privacy concerns, and political interest were based on previous literature, as were the following 2 variables, blocking behavior and engagement. So here, with the first one, blocking behavior, we wanted to see if people blocked political online ads in the last 3 months. And with engagement, we wanted to see if people shared, clicked, or liked a political advertisement. Coming to the results, this table shows the 6 statements measuring knowledge in wave 1 and wave 2. The statements capture the previously presented 4 knowledge dimensions. Percentages represent how many people correctly identified a statement as being incorrect or correct. For example, in the first row, you see that 40% of respondents in wave 1 correctly identified the first statement asking about general personalized advertising as incorrect. People had most issues with privacy and data collection statements. Next, we investigated voter characteristics predicting knowledge overall. So this knowledge score here that we used would be a composite score of the 4 knowledge dimensions, so of all 6 statements in wave 1 and in wave 2. What you can see here, for example, is the more politically interested people are, the more they know overall about data-driven political advertising. And that's true for wave 1, but also for wave 2. Interesting, taking into consideration the knowledge of wave 1, education does not predict knowledge in wave 2 anymore. Here we see the answers to our 4 expectations that I showed you before. And we see that young, male, highly educated, those who are more privacy concerned, and those who are politically interested indeed show more data-driven advertising knowledge, whereas self-efficacy does not seem to play a role. To get a more nuanced picture of how these predictors affect knowledge, I conducted an ordinal logistic regression analysis. Here, I conducted this in wave 1. You can see that here, but I also conducted it for wave 2. And I know this is a lot of information, but I will walk you through. So this table gives us preliminary findings and a better overview of which predictors affect which knowledge segment. For example, you might remember from the table that I showed you before with the composite knowledge scores, that more self-efficacy does not lead to more knowledge in either wave 1 or wave 2. But if we look at self-efficacy here in this table, we do actually see that in some cases, self-efficacy leads to more knowledge about privacy statements and data collection. And in another case, it leads to less knowledge. Why that is, I'm not completely sure. So I'm happy about your input. And what else we can see is that, for example, for males, overall, we saw before that males supposedly know more about females about data-driven advertising. But here we can clearly see that this knowledge advantage is mostly about privacy statements and data collection, but we cannot see it for general personalized advertising or online behavioral advertising. Furthermore, I'm not sure why privacy concerns increase the likelihood of having knowledge about online behavioral advertising. So that would be column 2, row 2. But more privacy concerns decrease knowledge about general personalized advertising. So your thoughts on interpreting this is also appreciated here. What I think is interesting is if we take into account knowledge from measure from wave 1, it made some effects disappear in wave 2. Now answering research question 2, how does knowledge affect campaign engagement? The more people know about data-driven advertising, the less they like to click on, share, or like political advertisements. We did not find an effect of knowledge on actively blocking advertisements. This might be because it's also more tricky to actually opt out. Some conclusive remarks. People have some knowledge, but they lack specific knowledge about political advertising and online data collection. So they specifically lack knowledge of technical knowledge and privacy protection and the role of social media. Unsurprisingly, older and lower educated people are less knowledgeable. Self-efficacy seems to play a role in privacy literacy, And perhaps this is because these statements really asked about what you can do to protect your privacy, such as deleting cookies or installing ad blockers, whereas this wasn't the case with the other statements. Political interest increases knowledge, and this is in line with previous literature on political knowledge. So I thought that was quite interesting. And knowledge can affect how people react to political campaigns. Of course, this study is not without limitations, but to only mention one point of improvement, I think it would be worth to also focus on attitudes towards data-driven advertising. Maybe this also affects how people, what people know about it. Yeah, and to finish, I have 3 takeaway messages. So I think we should keep on researching digital campaign competence of voters. Obviously, I have to say this because it's my PhD project, right? But I really think it's interesting because splitting knowledge can lead to more nuanced findings. It can inform literacy initiatives and inform us of who is left behind. And most importantly for me, it can support voters to contextualize political information that they receive in this new information environment. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. It's a great presentation. We have a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll just get started with those. One of the questions is to what extent do you think it is possible to separate knowledge about data-driven advertising in general and data-driven advertising in politics?
Sorry, I just had to stop the sharing. To what extent, I think, could you please repeat the question?
Sure, absolutely. To what extent do you think that it's possible to separate knowledge about data-driven advertising in general versus data-driven advertising in politics specifically?
Mm-hmm. I do think they are connected, of course, with different implications. So in designing the study, I also looked at research from advertising. So I don't think we can really separate it. I think I learned a lot from just looking at how people before me researched persuasion knowledge and how people react to advertising. But I think it's really important to also look at this political dimension here, because it comes with different implications. For example, if I am targeted for shoes online and I fall for this, then it only affects me. But if I am influenced in some way about a political decision, then I can, with my vote, also affect other people. So it's not only about me.
So I wanted you to talk a little bit about the demographics there. You talked a little bit about how some people are being left behind and who is being left behind. I wonder if you can just kind of think about or talk out loud about what that means in this study and how we might move forward thinking about addressing that issue.
Mm-hmm. So we saw that the usual suspects, those who are not so much educated or who are older, would benefit more from information about these topics. And I think we should really start early already in school to teach digital skills. That's where it starts, I think, but also look at the bigger picture of what does it mean then in a political context. So yeah, start early, start in school, but then don't really stop there, because I think it's such a interwoven topic where it's not only about where you come from, how old you are, and what your education level is, but also how concerned you are about your privacy. And this also stems from your demographics, and it's all connected. So I think, we just need to invest a lot in these literacy initiatives and start early on.
Do you think that this has changed drastically over the last couple of years, or has the issue been the same since you did this survey?
So from what I've read so far online, there's not a lot of research generally about political advertising knowledge. That it's not really there, I think, at least in the data-driven context. There is, of course, research about advertising literacy, and I do think that people got it over the years. That's what I see from literature, but there's still room for improvement here.
Yeah. So what are next steps forward?
Yeah, good question. For me, it's definitely to expand this knowledge measure, because I think these 4 categories, it's a good start, yes, but it's much more nuanced the more I read into it. So definitely taking into account more of the attitudes and persuasion knowledge, and trying to get the most from different academic worlds. I already started here a bit with political knowledge. I think we can get a lot of insight from that area, also to inform here the link to advertising literacy.
Yeah.
So that, and then in the next step, also some field experiments might be really interesting, where we can see to what extent giving people information would actually matter for them hands-on.
I think that's a really good question, especially thinking about the international context. And I wonder if we just have a few more minutes, maybe think about that a little bit. Like, how do you think this differs in different countries and continents? How do you think this would be different if we put it in a different country or a different context?
Also, very good point. I'm doing a joint PhD, so I'm between 2 universities in Vienna and in Amsterdam. So I am already a bit set up between countries. So this is definitely a topic for me. And for example, this was now from the Dutch elections. So I would guess that people from the Netherlands just have higher digital skills. I also see this in the literature compared to people from Austria, for example. And that this might also influence how you can judge implications of data-driven advertising for you. So, and this is only inside Europe. And of course, if you think broader, not only the education system here plays a role, but also the way society is, but also the political system, because most of this research comes from the US, but we can't take this over one-to-one. We really need to establish this knowledge here in Europe to apply it here. So yeah, the national context is always really important to take this into consideration, I think, with these knowledge topics.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, Sophie.
Thank you.
And we will move on to our next presentation now. That presentation is titled "The Gender Use of Social Media Among Political Candidates in Transition Contexts, Evident from Tunisia." And Malin Holm is presenting, I believe, and her co-authors she can introduce.
Yes, I will just share this one. Okay, so it works?
Yes, thank you and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me and for letting me present this paper that I've written together with Yasmine, Naila, Skhiri and Zetterberg at Uppsala University in Sweden. So yeah, the title is "The Gender Use of Social Media Among Political Candidates in Transition Context, Evidence from Tunisia." And this is a paper and a study that is part of a larger project where we study social media and gender in contentious elections. And one way to formulate our overarching research problem or question in this project is social media a blessing or curse for women that strive to influence politically in contentious elections? And here we partly, we draw on this, partly on this literature for this paper, equalization normalization theories. So on the one hand, we have the idea of equalization, that digital platforms, social media, you can use them at a low cost, they're accessible, you have a wide reach, etc. And if we also consider gender in these kinds of contexts, developing contexts, contentious elections, transition contexts that we study, it can also imply a new possibility for women, since these often still are confined to the private sphere, and that can make campaigning difficult. So this could be like a gender aspect of the equalization thesis, a new possibility for women in particular. And then we had a normalization idea or theory that while you can campaign on social media to a low cost, maybe it's still quite resource demanding to campaign efficiently. And in addition, when it comes to gender and women's situation on social media, it has been shown, and this research is emerging and growing, that political women are particularly vulnerable to online threats and harassment. So that can also create a problem for marginalized groups such as women in politics to campaign online, which ties into normalization then. Theory that already resource-strong candidates and privileged groups can use these platforms to a larger extent. So for this study then, and we also look at other aspects and the content on social media during the campaign, and to what extent it's targets politicians with violence and harassment, for example. But this study is more about like a mapping study of the gendered use of social media during the campaign for the Tunisian parliamentary elections in 2019. So we want to contribute with this kind of straightforward mapping study of the gendered use of social media in the campaign to the lack of studies on developing and transition context when it comes to the gendered use of social media in political campaigns, because that literature is very large, of course, but has mostly studied Western context or well-consolidated democracies. And we also want to contribute with a focus on gender and gender dynamics in online campaigning, since this also is, there are few studies that focus on it, but it's a bit overlooked. So before I go into data and methods, I just want to say some things about the Tunisian case, since we have selected that one. And we were actually going to Cambodia first to study this, but it became too authoritarian. We couldn't really study an election campaign as we wanted when Cambodia was having their last election. So we had to find a new case. And then the Tunisian case seemed quite relevant in relation to our research project and question. So partly then Tunisia has obviously recently transitioned to democracy. They had the first post-revolutionary national elections to parliament in 2014. And so this election that we study is the second one. They also have a relatively large proportion of the population that have internet access, which is not always the case in developing context, of course. In many cases, I mean, there's a boom in developing countries when it comes to ICTs, but when we looked at different cases, it was not always the case that, I mean, a large part of the population actually used internet and social media. So most of these are also on Facebook then, and Facebook is by far the largest platform in Tunisia. I mean, there is like 94% of those who have access to the internet that are on Facebook, and around like 3% is on Twitter and 1% on Instagram. So it's really like the by far most important platform. And also that women are quite well represented in parliament in Tunisia, around 26% at the moment. So it's possible to study gender dynamics in this context, because we have a variation then in the candidate's gender. And I also want to just point out, because it becomes relevant for the results, that the Tunisian case has a PR system with closed lists. So you are, so the parties get seats in parliament in relation to the vote share in every district. And they also have a quite ambitious but also ambiguous electoral gender quota system. So they have to alternate between men and women on their list. In each list, every second need to be a man and a woman, but they do not have to alternate the parties on the top of the list, which becomes important for the results later. So for this study, we used mixed methods approach. We combined statistical analysis with qualitative analysis. So we had one data set, which we compiled, consisted of official election data. And we took a random sample of what we believed or argued were viable candidates, 400 candidates, and then we manually mapped their Facebook accounts and if they had an account during the election. And then we did a statistical analysis on this, used this database for that, to find gendered patterns in use, so we controlled for list position, party, district, incumbent, elected or not. And then we also did so far 20 interviews with candidates that ran for this election. And we included both men and women and those who were not elected, as well as elected candidates. So then we analyzed the motives behind their use or non-use of social media as a campaign tool in vivo. So this was the data and methods. So the results then, when it comes to the statistical analysis, we show that men candidates, they are significantly more likely to have had a Facebook account during the campaign. 57% of the men candidates in comparison to the 45% of the women candidates, they had an account, and this was then significant. We also show that the fact that men candidates were more likely to have an account, it was driven by them having more, or to a larger extent, having public Facebook accounts. So this is a particular Facebook account that has been designed specifically for political campaigns. Among other things, there are different types of public Facebook accounts. So they are perceived as more professional, both among candidates, but also among voters. So there are studies that have argued for that these accounts are viewed as more professional. And men candidates were twice as likely to have these public Facebook accounts in comparison to women candidates then. So then we wanted to find out why men then were more likely to use Facebook as a campaign tool, and then why they had this public Facebook accounts to a larger extent. So when we controlled them for a list position and whether the candidates were elected, we can't find any gender differences anymore. So we conclude then that men are more likely to have a public Facebook account since they're more often placed on the top of the lists, because that is what explains that why they were more likely to have a public Facebook account. So that was the main result of the statistical analysis. And then when we looked at the interviews, we wanted to understand these results. So why, how can we understand these gender dynamics in Facebook use in the Tunisian case? And why this strong relationship between list position and Facebook use? So then we remember this electoral system they have in Tunisia, like they have this PR system with closed lists. So you can't move up or down in the list depending on how the election goes. The list is set from the beginning. And we also remember that Tunisia is this transition context where you have this kind of scattered party system, which is not very consolidated. There are many new parties. There's a very low party magnitude, which make only most lists, only the top candidates are elected, if anyone is. So why do we find this strong relation between list position and Facebook use? So one thing that came up in interviews very frequently was that the candidates perceived that the use of social media, in particular and the public Facebook accounts, are strongly related to access to financial and human resources reserved then also for the top candidates. So on the one hand, resources were connected to Facebook use. You need an assistant, you need other types of knowledge that are connected to maybe some assistance from the party. And these kind of resources were often then reserved for the top ones. So that was like one part of the explanation. And the second one was the motivation to use. social media, even if you had the resources. So when it comes to motivation, it was perceived as useless for those candidates that were placed lower in the list to campaign on social media or campaign at all, then, since these do not have a chance to win because they're placed lower and they know that they will not make it. So that's why they were not using social media during the campaign if they were not placed very high on the lists. So just to give you some more substance to these results, I'm just gonna just point out what some of the interviewees said. So, for example, one woman candidate, she said that to create a public Facebook account, you need an assistant that takes care of your account. Now I have been a parliamentarian for 1.5 years, so maybe I will soon be able to become more professional and create a public account for the parliamentary activities. Another woman candidate said that if I was to compare, the share of the list receives more resources locally from the party. The chair usually has an assistant and get more attention and support. And a third, one of our interviewees said, I am talking about using social media for campaign purposes. Otherwise, women are as present on social media platforms, but when it comes to election campaigns, social media then is mostly used by men. It is used mostly by those that have a chance to win the elections, which is a share of the list, and that is most often men and not women. Yeah, so these were some of the quotes that were from the interviews then. So to conclude this presentation then, and the implication of our results as well. So on the one hand, first, our results then suggest that social media in this case, it primarily became a campaign tool for already privileged candidates in the Tunisian context. In other words, it became a tool for top candidates, and it became then a tool for men candidates rather than women candidates. And in line with previous research, then this also points to that access to resources and being an incumbent and being high on the list, it is important explanatory factors, which has also been shown in Western context in consolidated democracies. But it also shows that partly we need to pay more attention to transition and developing context and the specific dynamics and contextual factors that are present in these contexts, as scattered party systems, low party magnitude, and greater variation in resources among political candidates, but also among different parties. But also how the design of the electoral system and the gender quota system sort of shapes these dynamics together with gender norms and create specific like contextual dynamics when it comes to the gendered use of social media in political campaigns. So one future extension of this study could be to look at other types of developing contexts where these factors vary. And for example, we have the case of Costa Rica, which has a similar PR system with closed lists, but has a quota system where you have to alternate between men and women on the top of the list. So it would be interesting to see if we would find a different result when they have a different quota system. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We have quite a few questions in this chat, but I'm going to start off with my own. Because I'm wondering a little...
Can I stop share?
Yes, absolutely.
And I can see the questions, yeah.
I'm wondering a little bit about the perceived uselessness, and if you could give like more examples about how they how women perceived their role as useless, or if men were perceiving women's role as useless.
No, it was more like they perceived that it was useless to campaign on social media because they wouldn't win the election or they didn't have a chance to win. So we asked them like, yeah, but I mean, one way to see it is that, yeah, if I could maybe climb within the party, or maybe if I can use social media to gain visibility and gain influence during the campaign, and that would be a reason for using it, even though you were not that high on the list. But they were like, no, but you don't think like that. You don't put any energy into the campaign if you're not very high on the list.
It's also interesting, the reliance on staff on a regular basis. I mean, so many of the comments that you brought up, it said, you know, I don't have an assistant. If I get an assistant, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role assistants play in the social media management of the campaigns of people who do use these social media accounts.
Yeah, it seemed very important, and it seemed like it was. I mean, it also depended, of course, on the candidates themselves. Some of them were very like tech savvy, and others were not. So then they could manage it somehow themselves. But assistants were important, and there was also a difference. I mean, some candidates had volunteers, so they didn't have to pay their assistants. Others did not, and so it was like a variation in what kind of assistance they had, and like but the resources, for example, from the party, it was a perception that they went to the top candidates and they could get assistance, but it was more difficult if you were not among those.
Got it. And we have a question in the chat that's asking about one of the quotes, and it says, did you verify the point that the interviewee made about the women being as present on Facebook in Tunisia as men? And this question is asked because there's a gender gap that is in India, and kind of talking about, maybe thinking about how that applies in other spaces and contexts.
No, we haven't looked into that like empirical claim.
Okay.
In the study. No, we didn't fact check her, but I mean, of course, we can look at that, like if it is a gender difference in general, and we can. I'm sure there are some. I hope there are some kind of data on that, and that would be interesting to see. It was more. So far, we only looked at the perceptions on their perceptions. Yeah.
And there are lots of similarities between the results of your research and the research conducted in established liberal democracies. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the overlap, or wondering how that fits in with this conversation and the implications.
Yeah, there is. It is in line with previous results, and maybe that is not very surprising. But what I think is interesting is like and also that in my perception, as I said in the end, like I haven't seen so many studies they have looked at how these factors interact and with gender. So they have found like, yeah, incumbency matters, list position matters, but not always why, like in terms of more like qualitatively. So how are these factors related, and how can we understand this relationship, and also in relation to gender? And I think that both could and could not be in line with this. And I mean the research on gender and gender use of social media during political campaign is, I mean, the result from this research is quite mixed. So, but I think it's, yeah. I have to think about that. But I think we haven't really thought that one like through, like how exactly we have developed this research and what exactly our contribution is. Yeah.
When you think about the Facebook campaigns that are launched, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the efficacy. Do you think they actually increase votes? And are they an important campaign tool? Do they actually work for candidates, or or are they just something that the higher ranking candidates have?
We haven't, I mean, that it's not part of our project, like to measure that, to what extent they are efficient. In this context, but I mean, social media is becoming increasingly important. The campaign, I mean, that is how the campaign has been described in electoral observations and like these kind of reports about the campaign. So I mean, it's becoming increasingly important. And of course, I mean, there are a lot of Tunisians on Facebook, and they have a lot of followers, these candidates and their accounts. So, and they are very active, many of them. So, I mean, it says something about the importance. But one interesting thing there is like, yeah, and when they talk about it themselves, they rate it as important, but not the most important part. So the most important part in this context is still the direct contact with the voters in their constituency. That is by far the most important campaign strategy and campaign part, and not social media. And that is also, I think, important to say and to understand. Right. So it's not that social media is like taking over the campaign strategy, but it's like, it's important, but not the most important part.
Right. And we have time for one more question. Leslie looks like she wants to unmute and ask her question. So if you want to go ahead and ask that.
Yeah.
Okay, hey, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have a couple questions about Facebook. And first of all, I did a presentation a couple weeks ago at the European Association of Japanese Studies on female and male candidates in the 2019 upper house election in Japan. I was focusing on Twitter. Okay, but one of the stats that I took was like the percentage of candidates who are, there's two systems in Japan. There's at the upper house elections, the prefectural level and a party list level, similar to what you're discussing in Tunisia. And I know a little bit about Tunisia because one of my grad students did her PhD on substantive representation of women, female candidates in Tunisia. And the thing that was interesting to me about your presentation regarding Facebook that I wanted to ask you is when you're talking about Facebook pages, a presence on Facebook, do you have any further subcategorization about that? Like, for example, my findings thus far, looking at different elections in Japan, is that the candidates use different types of Facebook, either a completely open fan page, or a follow this, or you have to become a friend, or things like this. So I'm interested in what is your definition and how you're doing this. How did you look only at the public fan pages? Did you delve further into actually following these candidates, which could skew, like add another number to them and their number of followers? Like, how did you deal with this? Because I find like I don't do very much Facebook related quantitative research for Japanese candidates simply because there's just too many different types of Facebook and it's not open enough. Even though their Facebook figures, their utilization figures for Facebook, whether or not just they have a Facebook address, is higher for women than men, and just a whole bunch of other stuff. You'll have to read the paper, I guess. But so would like to hear your take on this regarding that. And then my second question
we only have 1 minute left before our other presentation, so I'm gonna have to answer that one, and you're gonna have to email.
Okay, one comment. I love the qualitative aspect of this because I'm doing the same thing regarding a local level election. Interviews plus a quantitative analysis. So I love this approach. Just wanted to say that.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your question as well. Yeah, so we looked at public accounts and private accounts and Facebook accounts in general. So what we found was, as I said, what we found was interesting was that the difference was driven by that they had public accounts to different extent, men and women. So when it came to private accounts, and there were no gender differences. So public accounts are those accounts that you create when you're a public figure, and private accounts are those that you have a certain number of friends that you can accept, 5,000 I think, and then you can also create like a semi kind of public account with a following but. Do you say that? Yeah, button. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to put my email in the chat because I'd love to hear more from you. Okay. All right. I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on to our last presentation so we can stay on time. This is titled Pandemic Politics, Micro-Targeting Strategies on Facebook in India.
Right. So I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues Kiran, Arabaghatta, Basavaraj from the University of Exeter, who's in India right now, and Anup Kumar, who's at Cleveland State University. My name is Holli, Semetko, and I'm based at Emory University in the US. And we've been doing research based on a social science one data access grant on politics and social media in India, looking at Facebook India in particular, but not excluding Twitter in our past studies of the election campaign in 2019. And that continued with another study or over the period going into the 2021 assembly election campaigns. And so this is the result of us being motivated by what we saw in 2019 and what we conducted in the summer of 2020, which was a survey experiment that I'll present in a second. And then I'll turn to the ads that we're focusing on today. So today I'm focusing on how Facebook advertising, what Facebook advertising looked like among political parties during COVID in India. We know from election campaigns that Facebook ads are controlled by the Election Commission of India. That is, you can't publish an ad unless it's approved by the Election Commission of India first. During non-campaign periods, hands off, there's no real control. We expected there might be, since we saw so much negativity online between political parties, we thought we might see more in political advertising. It led to us looking at this study, also because our previous looking at Facebook ads during this time, also because our previous research, which I'll present in a moment, led us to wonder whether partisans or non-partisans were open to negative messaging in political advertising during COVID. So what you see on the right here is India's lockdown map for the first lockdown in March, starting in late March 2020 that ended in late May or sometime in May 2020. So I'll talk first about the background, then study design and data, the results and discussion. So in terms of background, just to give you a little background on India without going too much into the larger context, at the national level in the Lok Sabha, that's the lower house of parliament that passes all the legislation. Out of 543 seats, we see that opposition parties have 205 seats, and the largest party in the opposition is the Indian National Congress Party. That is also the oldest political party in India, and it is led by right now Rahul Gandhi, whose father Rajiv Gandhi was prime minister, whose grandmother Indira Gandhi was a prime minister, and whose great-grandfather Jawaharlal Nehru was also prime minister. In fact, India's first prime minister after independence from India, from British Raj. So we see that it's a very small number of seats. But it is higher than 2014. So this is a result of a sea change in Indian politics in 2014, moving from a coalition run by the Congress Party for the previous two terms to an absolute majority of seats, that is 285 seats in 2014, obtained by the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party. And that was probably largely, it's said to be due to, in 2014 at least, to the leader of the party, Narendra Modi, who came from a lower caste, who does come from a lower caste background and inspired many people. And by 2019 has actually shifted the shifted the demographics of voters for the BJP. So they've gone from an upper class or upper caste Hindu largely based voter group in 2014 to across all groups, across all castes, urban and rural, we see support. So this is the main problem that we see in India today, which is this big gap now between the opposition and the government. And so that's in the Lok Sabha, that's in the national parliament. However, in state levels, it looks a little different, as you can see from the colorful map over here, where the orange stands for the BJP states in which the BJP is in power. We see that there's currently many opposition parties in power across the states. That's not a message we usually get in Western media when we look at India. We don't hear much about state levels except for COVID counts. So we see the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, which is a union territory that has its own parliament. We see the BJD in Orissa in yellow there, which is not in an alliance with the BJP. We see the BJP is in orange here in Goa, Gujarat, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, and the northeastern, many of the northeastern states alone or in coalition. We see down in the bottom of the map here in red, the Communist Party Marxist is leading Kerala, the state known for health services. And ironically, it's the Communist Party Marxist leading the state, but the tourism appeal in the past pre-COVID was God's own country. Come and visit God's own country. And then we see on the bottom right, the Tamil Nadu, the DMK, which is another regional party that just came into power as a result of the 2021 assembly elections. So, you know, I don't want to go through every one of them, but the Trinamool Congress Party up in West Bengal, which is the dark blue to the right at the top, is very important state because Mamata Banerjee and Narendra Modi were at loggerheads during the campaign. The party was being targeted the state was being targeted by the BJP, which is now, as a result of the 2021 assembly elections, the opposition, the official opposition. So India has 28 states, 9 union territories, and so, it's a complex mixture of power and government and oppositions when we look at the state level, as opposed to just the national level. And so when we see opposition versus government during COVID-19, we need to remember that. And also remember that protest has always been a strategy for opposition parties in India and elsewhere, here in the United States, I can say absolutely. And also for political actors and activists, not direct party members, but working on the side of opposition, both inside and outside of national and state level parliaments and between election campaign periods. And although the initial lockdowns hindered street protests in India, there was a lot of activity on social media that piqued our interest. And so given the high attention paid by the news media to state level and national elections, when the Election Commission of India actually is there vetting all ads before they are allowed out in any type of media, we wanted to observe online advertising during COVID-19 for evidence on what it says about pandemic politics. And so the study is conformed by our earlier study of public perceptions of who to blame for the wave 1 of COVID-19 in India. And this is an abstract that I'm just going to summarize from, which was just published in July in Political Psychology. The link is here and it's available to download now. They're going to put a paywall up pretty soon. So if you're interested, please do feel free to download it. We were drawing on social identity theory and research on digital media and polarization. And we used a quasi-experimental design in the sense that we had 2 national surveys. One had a set of blame questions and the other had no blame questions, which we combined using propensity score matching. And so we were able to provide causal evidence on perceptions on who's to blame for the initial spread of COVID in India, which was a bit of a controversy in case you were paying attention at that time. According blame to 3 different social and political entities. These were the dependent variables. One was Tablighi Jamaat, a Muslim group that was having a big conference up in Delhi. It was not just a domestic conference where there are Tablighi Jamaat members across the country. It's an old and well-known, esteemed, Muslim kind of missionary style group, but they've brought in people from Indonesia and Malaysia. That led to some suspicion that these people coming into the country, might have brought it into the country. Also, a second possible target is the Modi government for not, shutting down airports too early, right? And a third is the migrant worker population. That is a lot of lower income states sent to higher income states. So you see people moving across the country, and we saw migrants violating the lockdowns, trying to get home because they had no more pay, no way to function really when their factories closed down. And they're a very heterogeneous group of all faiths. And so they've served as the dependent variables in 3 different OLS regression models. We were testing the effect of the no blame survey question treatment, and we controlled for Facebook use, social identity, that is religion, vote in the 2019 election, and other demographics. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, those in the treatment group were more likely to allay blame rather than accord blame to those 3 targets. But surprisingly, effective polarization, that is dislike for outgroup members, was social identity based, that is religion based, and not partisan based. And Facebook, Instagram use was not significant. And so we saw that people who voted for Congress or its United Progressive Alliance parties in 2019 were significantly less likely than regional other smaller parties, as you would have just seen in that map, regional party voters or state level parties, to blame the Narendra Modi government for the initial spread of the virus. So our conclusion there was, unlike the extant research in Western countries, especially the US, where it's almost synonymous, that is effective and political polarization are seen as synonymous, they appear to be distinct concepts in India, where social identity, we argue, is complex and is important to consider. So we see sort of weak, wavering support here for Congress and the UPA. And this was a survey conducted in August of 2020 about, what thinking back to what it was like when at the initial months of the virus. And here's the treatment effects, where you see the migrants are not affected, but perceptions in the control group and in the treatment groups, you can see that perceptions, blame was allayed in both the cases for the Modi government and Tablighi Jamaat. So with that in mind, we were inspired to consider what's happening now, especially when propaganda we knew was being put forward by parties during the campaign. And so we were looking at Facebook ads. We downloaded ads between March 2020, March 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2021. The ads were downloaded from the ad library API, select the country, India, select issues, politics, elections. And we were looking at 2 separate searches, one on COVID and one on health. And then we combined the 2 and duplicates were removed. So we had a total of 11,500 ads approximately. The text of the ads were then translated into English using national NLP techniques, natural language processing. And then we had 11 Indian languages here that we were working with. And then of those ads, we identified 2,424 unique ad sponsors, which we then coded each one. We had to go through each one and research the Facebook page to determine if it was a political page or not. And ideally, if it was a political page, we had to determine which party, if possible. And this metadata was then merged across the 11,508 ads. And then we removed the non-political ads. So what we're talking about today here, and the evidence we're presenting in models, is 4,138 political ads that we concluded were the corpus of ads over this long period, this 16-month period. So unique ad sponsors were coded as non-political. The ones that were left out here were news media, NGOs, and hospitals especially. Now, the news media may have had an occasional, critical negative ad about one party or another in a news item, but for the most part, we saw in the news media just advertising the topic of COVID and tune in and see us in order to learn more about it. So with respect to coding, we also were faced with the challenge that, we had to do some manual coding here. So we saw, first of all, government pages were sponsoring many ads, state government, Department of Health, district level Facebook pages, and some national level pages, all of which are run by civil servants. So there we might not expect to see much in the form of negativity. We would expect everywhere to see this type of neutrality in state government messaging coming from the civil servants running the bureaucracies. We also saw these political ads were from a whole range of individuals, former members of legislative assemblies, former MPs, current ones, as well as corporators, they're called, at the municipal council level, and party members, activists, and also personally sponsored ads, and as well as the chief minister's offices, health minister's offices in different states. So we ran into the issue that that using natural language processing Vader polarity software led us to see that sentiment was always being coded negatively when COVID was mentioned, when fighting COVID was mentioned, combating COVID was mentioned, or the virus was mentioned. And this was odd because, of course, these were motivational messages, encouraging people to help us combat the virus, right? So we went through and eventually decided to manually code all of these for sentiment. Especially, we started with the negative messages first, those that had been machine coded negative. And many of those were recoded as positive and neutral based on decision rules, such as, when you're being invited to attend an event, or when a politician is talking about taking action by going to one hospital or another and visiting people and just talking about what they're doing, or even in a death announcement, when death normally is coded as negative by the machine, but when they're offering the fact that the person died, but what a wonderful person this was and what a great contribution they made, we decided to code those handful of death announcements in this data as positive because they were making a great statement about an individual. So we were manually coding sentiment, and we are also manually coding the sender and the target of the ad. Positive ads were usually self-promotional. Negative ads were criticizing a target, usually a party target, and sometimes claimed, or many times claimed, that the sender could do better. So here are some examples of negative ads you see on the left here.
In about 15 minutes. Just wanted you to know we don't have questions in the chat, but so you can keep going if you'd like, but we have about 7 minutes left.
Okay, fine. So here you can see from one state, this is the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, the largest by population state in India with 200 million people. One of the criticisms is that the BJP government miserably failed in containing the spread of the virus, made India the world's fastest growing COVID hotspot. This was in July of 2020. And they argue that, this is highly politicized. They have no interest to control the pandemic, and they're busy trying to topple the elected government in Rajasthan. So Rajasthan, it's funny because it's not funny, but it is funny that ironically, Rajasthan was one of the biggest senders of ads, and it is a Congress-led state. So this was a motivated, obviously negative ad. Here's another one. I don't know which state this is from, but no oxygen, no ventilator. And this was in 2021. So this is, right after the assembly elections in 2021, show humanity, please listen to my opinion, organize beds in marriage halls, right? And then another critical ad here from Openly Frank is from, again, fall of 2020, saying the central government's inability to pay general services tax compensation back to the states due to COVID-19 crisis has been termed a so-called act of God. So complaining and connecting the economic issue. So we see here that in terms of Facebook ads, we see the Congress Party, INC, was sending the most ads, BJP in all its forms next. So when I say Congress or BJP or any political party, I refer to more or less individuals who identify with the party or state level parties and some national level parties, sometimes the national level party. We see third comes the government departments of health, then Trinamool Congress Party in West Bengal, the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, and the SAD, the Sikh Party in Punjab and Delhi. And then we see independents that we couldn't identify as with a party, or they were naming themselves as independents in the municipal level. That's what they often do. And others that could not be classified, despite our deep research, as political specific senders, party senders. Then we see later different states like the Telugu Desam Party and the YSRCP. Those are both parties in Andhra Pradesh, or the NCP, the Nationalist Congress Party, which is a breakaway from the Congress Party, when three gentlemen in the 1990s decided they didn't want Sonia Gandhi to be the leader. They formed the Nationalist Party, of the Congress Party, but they're in alliance now with Shiv Sena, a former ally of the BJP. So those are around the top 10 cases of senders. And when we look at this, you can see that while green is positive and red is negative, it's abundantly clear that most of these ads, the vast majority of these ads, were promotional, what we would call self-promotional ads or motivational ads, encouraging people to listen to this next podcast or watch this show or whatever. And very, few, comparatively few negative ads, the most coming from the Congress Party to the BJP and from the Aam Aadmi Party to the BJP. And so we also see some from the BJP to the Congress Party and from the BJP down to the Trinamool Congress Party and a number of others in an election that was coming up. Here's another way of looking at the number of positive ads versus neutral or negative ads that we saw, which is just a bar chart. Here's the timeline. And here we have it marked by the first lockdown here, then the second, then there was a second and third lockdown, and then finally everything was opened in sometime late May, early June. And then we see peaks in ads here by the Congress Party, and then by government departments here, and by the BJP here. And then here we move into this 2021, we see the vaccine drive starting, and we see the second wave starting. And so government departments are very active here. And then we see the state assembly elections coming up in West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Assam. And so many of the parties that are active in those races are here, listed in order of the the party that sent the most ads, right? Yeah, and so we see during the campaign, so we had region-based micro-targeting, which showed in this model, mixed effects model, spending was significant and important for reach, but ads by the BJP and INC and government departments had less reach than the Trinamool Congress Party, which was being advised by India's IPAC, Prashant Kishore. And so it had a very effective reach. Also, Shiv Sena had an effective reach, and you can see with random effects on ads, they had greater reach in the 5 states run by opposition parties to the BJP, and also in 2 states run by the BJP. And finally, parties-based micro-targeting, we have, looking again at the dependent variable of reach, we have spending, again, a positive predictor. Gender is not positive, gender female is not a positive predictor. We see age groups across all age groups, significant, but younger groups under 44 positive and older groups not. And then we see here sentiment is significant, but both add negative and add positive sentiment is significant. And again, we see with random effects by party, a lot of similarity to what we just saw, which is the states and the parties in those states that were largely contesting in elections, but also in opposition to the BJP having more reach, greater reach. So to conclude, we provide in this study fresh evidence from India that really challenges the idea that negative ads travel farther or have greater reach. Our region-based micro-targeting model found sentiment had no effect. And in the parties-based model, both positive and negative ads were significant predictors of reach. So it's refreshing to see that during this very difficult time in India and the whole world, political parties and government departments at all levels were pushing positive or motivational messaging in ads most of the time. And the Election Commission of India was not vetting these until the assembly election was called in March 2021. And so this was happening on their own. We see that opposition parties were often running ads. The Congress Party ran the most ads over this time period. And states where the Congress Party or other opposition parties were in power also ran the most ads over the time period, providing evidence of the visibility of pandemic politics as one of government versus opposition, or opposition, let's say, versus government. We're now turning to study Facebook posts over the same time period and have downloaded over 2 million posts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an amazing presentation with a ton of information. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we won't be able to ask questions, but there are a couple of comments in the chat. If you'll share your contact information that people wanted to know about the methodology specifically.
Oh, sure. I can get back to the chat. Here we go. Yes, I'll just send my email address. Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
And congratulations to all the panelists who presented today. It was a pleasure to be your moderator, and I will turn the floor back over.